are, the present perfect, that's just barely evident in the A1, comes up at A2, and it's sort of hanging in there. That present perfect problem sticks around, but it's nowhere as apparent as the confusion between the past simple and the present simple. Now, I'm just going to give you examples again so that you see that these errors are actually very positive because they're indicative of the development. So at A1 example, his name is Nabil. He lived in France. So just a basic subject-verb example. At A2 example, I want to sell my computer. It was 3 years old. So they should have used the simple there, simple present. Let's move up to B1 then, the threshold. He worried because his mother told him, so now we're getting into reported speech, tricky territory, told him that if, and we're putting in a conditional in there, if he lose one more thing, he would be punished. That's very complicated, isn't it? So much more complicated than the A level. So while the error rate jumps up, it's because they're trying to do so much more with a seemingly basic grammatical item. So the notion that we can leave something easy to the A levels, it doesn't really work because as the learner's grammatical complexity grows, the errors also grow, or they need more recycling or consolidation. Now let's just look at a B2 example. Not only did we have an excellent distribution network, but we also have retail outlets. So complex negation example there. Okay, the tense is wrong, but it's evidence of, yet again, a growth in the syntactic growth and development of the learner. Now, I'm going to hand over to Geraldine now, who's going to look at countability, another item that we see as maybe something that can be compartmentalized, but Geraldine will illustrate it in terms of its developmental nature.
Thanks, Anne. So I want to look at the area of countability. We've looked at a tense. We want to draw it back to a word level and to show that we can't just look at words in isolation. When we're looking at grammar, we need to look at the grammar of words. So I'd like to look at when we first teach countable nouns, what your opinion is of that. When do you think that normally happens? What are the most common errors with countable nouns? Uncountable nouns, sorry. Where do you expect to find the most errors with uncountable nouns? And what other errors do we see occurring with uncountable noun errors? So I'll just give you a couple of seconds just to have a think about that, and then we'll look at where they're being introduced mainly. Okay. Okay, thanks. Can you hear me at the back? Yeah, okay. So when do we teach countable, uncountable nouns? Early, okay. A1, A2, and we teach them with there is, there are, nouns, have got, nouns, so many, much many, determiners. And often we teach them in the context of food. We have some nice examples with food, because food categories fall nicely into countable and uncountable nouns. So let's take a little look at what the most common errors are with uncountable nouns. So we see here, we have information's overwhelmingly the most common error. Advices, equipments, transports, trainings, homeworks, knowledges, researches, furnitures, works, spendings. We have no food nouns in there. We have mainly abstract nouns. Now, how do those errors break down across all of the levels? We can see here that the word informations as an error occurs in all of the levels. It persists all the way through, from A1 all the way through to C2. Similarly, advices, equipments, homeworks, trainings. And then we see some of these errors disappearing as we go into the B levels. But as the vocabulary expands, as Alan was talking about, and the complexity expands, and the complexity of vocabulary expands, so we see more errors creeping in. So when do these errors actually occur most frequently? Where would you suggest they occurred most frequently? Low level, mid-level? Okay, we see these errors occur most significantly at B2 and C1 level, where we think we might have got the hang of accountability by now. But interestingly enough, we're still getting more and more errors appearing as the vocabulary is expanding. Here are a few examples. So when we're looking at noun countability and uncountable nouns, we're not only looking at the nouns themselves, but we're also looking at the errors that occur around the nouns. So we're going to get errors with determiners and errors with verb agreement. Let's just have a look at what happens with determiners as we go through the levels. I had a look at the most common determiners that appear before the word, the correctly used information. And we can see that at A1, we've got quite a small selection of determiners being used there. But as we get to C2, the complexity is obviously much more complex. We're looking at determiners, adjectives, but we've still got an error in there appearing at the bottom there. We've got an information which occurs with information at C2. So what happens when we look at agreement with countable nouns? I started to look at the present simple, and I was looking at the verb that occurred with the most common error, and that verb was the verb to be, probably unsurprisingly because it's one of the most common verbs that we use. And I looked at agreement errors with is and are. And what I found was that the agreement errors with is and are also occurred most commonly at B2 and C1 level. And actually, when you look at the words that occur with them at B1, at C1 level, you find that most of those words that occur with the errors are actually uncountable nouns. So even we've got a trade-off really going on here. We've got the errors with uncountable nouns, but we've also got those errors with uncountable nouns also introducing other errors. So not only do we look at the words themselves, we also need to look at the grammar around them. We can't just look at the words in isolation. And then we wanted to go and have a look at what was being presented in course books, and just did an overview of the most commonly used course books from all the publishers. And see that at A1 and A2, we see huge input for countability. There are. But obviously, as you go through the levels, at C1 and C2, there's very, very little input. But it's still an error. So going back to what Anne was saying before, we can't just look at the errors that occur at A1, or the fact that students can do something at an A1 and then assume that they can do it at C2 as well, because as the vocabulary expands and the grammar becomes more complex, so do more errors get introduced. I'd like to now hand over to Mike. He's going to look at the patterns across language and spoken language.
Okay, well, thank you for that. What we've tried to do so far is to introduce the complexity of the questions that we have to ask to illustrate that complexity. So in other words, what we're saying is grammar is neither simply syntax nor is it simply item choice. Grammar is a very delicate relationship between the syntactic patterns and the items that enter into those patterns, as if we didn't know that anyway. But it really comes out very strongly in this corpus information. Now, thinking in terms of these patterns, and we've now come to a point where we have to think of the patterns as lexicogrammatical, as Halliday might have said. In other words, we are neither thinking solely of a syntactic choice nor solely of a vocabulary choice. We're thinking in terms of a word grammar. Across the levels, more complex patterns emerge, and the examples that Anne and Geraldine gave both underline this, that the errors are not simply, oh, you've got the wrong word, tough. They are because of a variety of choices that you've made. The patterns are tied to the lexical items which emerge in the expanding lexicon. Therefore, it means that for a project like the English Profile Project, you cannot easily separate the vocabulary from how it's used in grammatical realizations. And the B-level grammar, therefore, to answer one of our original questions, what constitutes a B-level grammar for learners? Well, answer number one is that B-level grammar becomes increasingly lexicogrammatical. Come back, Michael Lewis, all is forgiven, you know. I think he was going to come back, wasn't he? Yes, I don't know if he ever did. I want to show you an example then of these patterns, and this is some research which I did with ditransitive verbs. Sounds like a character from South Wales. It simply means verbs that have two kinds of objects, two kinds of predicates upon them. So a classic core choice in English is between the indirect object and direct object pattern. She always gave the children presents, and its alternative realization, which is a direct object followed by a prepositional phrase. She always gave presents to the children. So these two patterns are ubiquitous in the language, and numerous verbs can be realized in either of those patterns. And I want to have a look at how those patterns in particular emerge across the Keffer levels. So I'll do what Geraldine and Anne did. That is, first of all, take the big picture, the overall picture, the normalized totals for the kinds of mistakes you find. And at A1 and A2, you find that the mistakes are numerous. Perhaps not surprisingly, because this is quite a difficult structure, and it's probably tried out, but not properly taught and embedded at that level. The red, the prepositional structure pattern presents more problems. Not surprisingly. The first pattern is just a question of word order. The second pattern, the prepositional pattern, involves additionally the choice of a preposition. So perhaps not surprising that we find a lot of error there. Now, the interesting thing is that the errors decline, as we might expect, so that by C2, you've largely speaking, even by C1, I'm sorry, you've mastered, you've controlled this direct object, indirect object pattern. But there's a kind of persistent level of error with the prepositional phrase pattern. Now, what does one conclude from this, or what does one do about this? Do we say, well, learners are no good at prepositional phrases? You know, that's one conclusion. Or do we drill down further into the data and see if we can find out what exactly is going on and what kinds of confusions are being encountered? If we separate the verbs out individually, and I'm going to start with the verb give, because that was the canonical word I used, then the graph looks different. It looks slightly different. And we find that there are quite a lot of errors with the preposition